Hey everybody, SuperMagicalCup here with another meta timeline video. This time it's going to be number 4.
Number 4, and this is the first balance update after the first game update, right? So the game came out, it launched globally in early January. On February 2nd, there was the first, actual client update on your phone, along with the balance update. And only a week later, Supercell did another balance update. Now, the kind of background to why they did a balance update so shortly after the last one was because they announced on February 7th that the game would be going global. They didn't say when, but for those who don't know, Supercell will release games, try them out in like a geo-lock launch, like it'll be like Canada, Australia, that's it, and then decide whether or not they want to release it globally. This was a big announcement because it would be Supercell's 4th game, with the other 3 being all major hits, right? So I think from Supercell's standpoint, they wanted to do a lot of balance updates really quickly to get the game to the state they wanted it in so they could launch it globally. So with only 7 days after the last balance update, they did another one. And like the last one, this was very focused on offense over defense at almost every step.
So we talked a lot about how Crossbow and Inferno Tower were these really strong units, and there were some interesting interactions that we saw between people playing stuff like really CG cycle decks, and then having things like the Giant Skeleton being the big defending troop. Even after the Inferno Tower was hit a little bit, they would just use those in tandem to really protect themselves really well against any kind of aggressive attack. So as you mentioned, aggressive units in Clash Royale are going to see almost universal strength increases bit by bit. Whether or not they were enough, I think remains to be seen, and I think as the patch kind of played out, it was becoming clear that they needed to do more to help offense out. But let's take a look at some of the changes that they released. The first one is the Mini P.E.K.K.A. got its hit points increased by 3%, and it's somewhat of a small increase. It's a suggestive.
We always talked about this with even some of the nerfs we saw. Like, these nerfs weren't really meant to nerf the card, but just to make people think the card was nerfed so they'd go away from it. I think Mini P.E.K.K.A. hit points increased by 3% was sort of the same thing. I think they knew there was a lot of value to this card, but people for whatever reason weren't. So they used the patch notes as sort of a, hey, go look at this. Maybe it makes the Mini P.E.K.K.A. survive one more tower shot, which is valuable for a card that's so binary. What's cute is the little line here. Mini P.E.K.K.A.'s usage is quite low, which is unfortunate for such a charismatic character. Hopefully this little buff will make it a more enticing card. Like, that is not the world we live in nowadays, Rainy. Like, Mini P.E.K.K.A. might be one of the most popular cards at the time we're making this video, so it's funny to think that with almost no changes, I mean, I think this was the last time Mini P.E.K.K.A. was buffed or nerfed at the time we're making this video, people were not really using Mini P.E.K.K.A.
Yeah, so interesting change, and of course Mini P.E.K.K.A. would later come to its own, at least in current time as we're recording this. Let's take a look at the next thing. The Valkyrie is oftentimes a well talked about card, and you mentioned before that a Valkyrie was actually not really that great.
Valkyrie was among the worst cards in the game. It gets a huge buff a few balance updates from now, but around then they were trying to figure out like what could make Valkyrie work, what could make it better. They decided to increase the attack speed. This actually didn't do much. It didn't actually make the card much better. One of the biggest problems with this card was that Tombstone was very popular. Tombstone was one of the most popular defensive cards. It lasted for 60 seconds. It spawned 6 skeletons when it died. It was very strong. In the last update, they reduced Tombstone to 40 seconds, but it still made a lot of skeletons and whatever. The problem with Valkyrie is that she walks, stops, spins, starts walking, stops, spins. So a Tombstone would just sort of lock her in place and never really made a lot of progress against that card in general. And also she just had lower damage, lower hit points, all sorts of other things. Wasn't seen a lot. So this was an attempt to get Valkyrie played more, but it didn't. It was still a very terrible card around this time.
Giant hit points increased by 5%, and Giant later becomes, at least as of our time recording this, becomes a very staple kind of solid tank card. It is like the most vanilla tank card that you can get. High health, good amount of damage, building chasers, slow moving. They gave it the hit point increase, and I don't know what other changes they made to the Giant aside from this.
I think this might be at the time that we're recording this, I believe this was the only change ever made to a Giant. I think his damage got increased in an earlier balance update that we recovered. The problem here, to me, wasn't that Giant was underpowered. It's that at the time there were level 8 epics, but only level 10 rares and level 12 commons. They later on added an extra level to commons and rares. So the downside is that when they say it's underused in the late game, it's not because Giant at level 10 was underpowered, it's that epics at level 8 were better. Like, of course you would use P.E.K.K.A. or Golem instead of these things, because it was almost like it was one level higher than it should have been. Right. I remember making jokes about this buff because a few months later, Jason the Giant wins the Helsinki tournament with a Giant deck, and we all were kind of joking in the crowd like, hey, remember when they buffed Giant because it wasn't good enough? As it's rolling over everyone in this tournament. So yeah, I think it's a good buff in order to try to make the Giant used a little more, but the thing that really made Giant used more was when they balanced out the epics versus rares and other cards.
So interesting to see how changes made previously kind of roll themselves around into the future when the meta shifts entirely and kind of really makes a big difference. So the next change we have is Tombstone spawns 4 skeletons when destroyed instead of 6, and you mentioned this a little bit, and again this goes into kind of defensive cards. Tombstone is quite a good defensive structure, a unique one, but very useful.
I remember, so Hog Rider was just starting to come into the metagame around this time, around the last update, because Inferno Tower got nerfed and Cannon got reworked, but people didn't quite understand yet that to put it in their deck. So there was a period where Hog Rider was very popular, and Tombstone was the card that people played to counter Hog Riders. And I remember when they said, oh, it's going from 4 skeletons to 6, we all thought, Hog Rider's gonna run wild on everyone. Like, how are you gonna stop it? But then once the buff went in, the 4 skeletons still did a good amount of damage and ended up killing the Hog Rider. I think I think we were all panicked about this nerf, but once it actually went in, the 4 skeletons were still fine.
We're still well and good enough. Mortar lifetime increased to 30 seconds from 20 seconds, and you mentioned in the previous meta timeline that one of the big problems that Mortar was having was that it just didn't last long enough. Even if you let the Mortar just sit there and shoot, in the end it didn't last long enough, so the damage output was just not really that satisfying.
Yeah, in the last balance update there was a rework that took it from a 6 elixir card down to a 4 elixir card. And what they had done was reduced its lifespan from like 40 seconds to 20 seconds. Well, that's, if you think of how buildings, the lifespan is their attack damage, that was like a 50% damage nerf on top of an actual damage nerf they did to it. So adding the extra 10 seconds was sort of like a 50% damage buff, and I think did a good job at making Mortar viable. I actually, around this balance update, this was the balance update where people started shifting over to Mortar from Expo. I would say after this Expo still existed and Mortar was there as well, the next balance update was when it really truly became Mortar instead of Expo. But this is still like the last vestiges of Expo being the best deck in the format, and I like that they buffed Mortar to try to make it more of an option. It didn't feel like you just had to play this one card if you wanted to play this kind of strategy.
All right, Bomb Tower. This is going to be an interesting one because I think a few patches later, after kind of the global launch of the game, Bomb Tower becomes a very largely discussed tower because it ended up actually becoming very used in the months after this. Yeah,
so it's funny, the last update went from 1.8 seconds to 1.7 seconds, and Bomb Tower is one of the least used cards in the game, give it a shot. A week later, they're like 1.6 seconds from 1.7. It's still one of the least used cards, give them a chance. After this update, and we'll talk about the Tesla buff too, Tesla and Bomb Tower became very commonly played, and actually one of the best decks in the format became like Bomb Tower, Tesla, and rockets and fireballs, and you just would rocket cycle people. It was a deck that really came out of the Eastern meta, the Chinese players and things like that really sort of innovated on it, and you'd pick it up from the ladder and try it yourself and be like, this deck's insane, like nobody can beat Bomb Tower. Inferno had been reduced from 60 seconds to 45 seconds, but Bomb Tower still had a 60-second lifespan. Tesla Tower still had a 60-second lifespan, and after this update where they buffed 2 of the towers, the whole rocket cycling really became a big deal. Musketeer damage decreased by 25% and elixir cost reduced to 4. So much like how we talked about it before with the cannon, kind of like bringing it into line of, as of recording this, the cannon that we know, and the kind of, this is a similar, it brings it down to the musketeer that we know. Obviously the damage nerf was quite significant compared to the elixir cost nerf. Yeah, okay, so this was weird. We've said in the earlier balance updates, Musketeer was really not a factor in the early games, the early days of Clash Royale, and you can even see it in the patch notes here. It's played second fiddle to Wizard for too long. Like, that's, in what world nowadays does that ever happen? But, it was true. Wizard did so much damage that it was really your primary single target and splash damage choice, because Musketeer cost the same, didn't really have a reason that you would use it over the Wizard. So this update was trying to set it apart by putting Musketeer in between Archers and Wizard at the 4 cost spot, which there wasn't really a lot of range, actually wasn't any range attackers at 4 cost at the time. So, but I remember thinking, well, I don't play Musketeer because his damage isn't good enough compared to Wizard. And when you see this, the elixir cost is reduced by 20%, but then the damage is reduced by 25%. So Musketeer, a card that was already not played, became worse for the elixir cost than it was later. It seems so weird to me that they would even make this change. And sure enough, nobody played Musketeer after this because it was not efficient for the cost. But in the very next balance update, they buffed the Musketeer's damage up to better than what it was. And after that, Musketeer becomes a staple in the metagame. But it's funny to think about that there was a good like month and a half of the game when it first came out that Musketeer and Valkyrie were just like not, and really Hog Rider, like almost the entire trifecta deck was not really a problem.
Currently very used in the meta.
Yeah, no kidding.
As we're speaking.
Yeah.
Tesla, you mentioned this a little bit, damage increase, and this is all very interesting to me overall because Supercell was really on about offense over defense. Obviously, they still gave a little bit of love to defensive structures, and I think part of it is this idea that they will continue to propagate of just like wanting to get all their cards involved in some fashion. And so underused cards was a large focus of a lot of their changes. And I think this speaks to it with the Bomb Tower and a Tesla. Yeah,
because after prior to this update, they had nerfed Inferno Tower, but people were like still using Inferno Tower because a 45-second Inferno Tower was pretty strong. So I think this is their attempt to try to get it to be like, hey, make it a choice of either Inferno or Bomb or Tesla or Cannon. And their thought was like, well, we had already brought Inferno down low enough, so let's bring some of the other towers up to that level. It turns out this level was still too high, and they go through a balance pass of like ding, 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 slowly bringing all the towers down a notch. But this was their attempt to make the then bad Tesla, the then bad Bomb Tower to the same level of their Inferno Tower that was just still overpowered. Worth mentioning, one of the least used cards in the game, little damage boost. This very quickly becomes a not true statement. Tesla becomes probably the most used defensive tower. Maybe not this update, but very shortly.
Very shortly after.
This one was a brutal nerf.
Crossbow, that has been the focus of the meta for a long time,
yes, man,
is getting a significant deploy time increase, and that actually changed the game in a very big way. Kind of, I see deployment time increase a very similar change to kind of elixir cost reductions in terms of the scale of how it changes the card.
This was a huge nerf. I mean, I would say that this, along with the Mortar change, was the first death blow to Expo. Expo gets one more nerf after this that truly death blows it. But what ended up happening was you could no longer play Expo with a cavalier attitude like you used to be able to. You just put it out there, it'll be fine. Now with the really long deploy time, you started to see a shift of these Expo decks more towards what we think of as a modern Expo deck, where you try to set it up with like a tower or a troop in front, and then you play it behind to cover for that 5 seconds. You just play it. Just play it and cast it. I remember the big Expo deck after this became an Expo Tesla deck. Expo had a longer range, had 1 square longer range than it does at the time we're making this video, and it'll probably never have this long of a range again. Because what you used to be able to do, and people took a while to figure it out, but once they did, was that you had 2 squares in front of your Expo, which was enough to stick a Tesla tower. So what people would do is they would, maybe you had something coming down the river, they'd play a Tesla behind your thing so it would kill whatever in front of the tower, and then you could play the Expo with the Tesla directly in front of it. So there was no way to get to the Expo without getting through the Tesla tower first, and that put up a speed bump or a time buyer or defensive thing that you could even drop more things in front if you needed to. So Expo decks took a little bit, at first they went away, then they sort of evolved into this Expo Tesla setup, but this was sort of, this update was the last time that Expo was the best deck in the meta. And I would say after this 2.9 update went in was really when we started to see the decline of Expo.
Decline of Crossbow, perhaps not the decline of Siege.
Definitely not, because Mortar quickly swoops in to replace it. It does not take very long for all those Expo players to migrate over to Mortar. Sure.
All right. Moving down to the last few changes. Zap continually making kind of somewhat ineffective changes.
Yeah, it's worth remembering at the time that Zap didn't stun. Zap was just a cheaper, smaller radius, less damage arrows. And everyone played arrows, and no one really played Zap. It just wasn't worth it. I mean, like, yeah, you can zap goblins, but it didn't kill minions even after this damage increase. So it was one of those things where it's like, well, what am I using it for on offense or defense, right? It's not too long after this that they decide to add the stun to it, but this didn't really change anything. No one really played Zap even after this damage update, because really no interactions were changed. It was just 6% more damage. It's not like, oh, here's the thing that used to die that now dies to it. It's just an arrows.
Yep.
And then the final change relatively small, but not bad idea. Now, Arena 3 to 7 chests now contain more cards, more gold, cost more gems, but are overall a better value. I do remember this going in as well. It's funny, just as a last note, this was before Super Magical chests and Giant chests existed. At the time, there were only silver, gold, and magicals, and that was it. And when you went to the store, like the store tab, and you could buy 3 chests, your options were silver, gold, and magical. So this was just really just a rebalance to make, for example, like a magical chest might cost $5, and I'm just making up numbers, right?
Yeah.
$5 and give you 100 cards. Well, now it costs $6, but gives you 130 cards. So it was like, it was better cards for the dollar, but the dollar price overall went up a little bit. I think part of the reason why was that if you were trying to like max out or otherwise gem up a bunch, you had to buy magical chests one at a time. Well, think about like how super magical chests are like 7 magical chests, and it's easy, like, doom, give me all my stuff. You would have to sit there and like put in $100 of gems and open up like 20 magicals one at a time, and then get another or whatever. It just took a while. So I think this was maybe a change to allow people who wanted to gem up quickly to get more for their money while also getting to do it faster.
Yeah.
So doing it $3 at a time.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting changes, and of course this is, as Rumham mentioned, right before the game was about to have its global launch, which will happen
Less than a
soon
month.
after. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. The game will go a long way between then and
Supercell goes pretty rapid fire through the balance changes from here. They do another balance update, which will be episode 5 of the meta timeline, about 10 days after this, and then they do another balance update 10 days after that. So there are 3 balance updates between the February 2nd update and the March 2nd global launch. There's several balance updates in there, and this was one of 3.
Make sure you guys stay tuned in for Meta Timeline. Look forward to after the global launch, because I think patch changes are going to be a lot different, because now you have a large amount of the player base starting to really learn how to play this game and play it a lot, which is going to inform Supercell a lot about how their cards interact. And you know, a lot of the things that we talked about, like unexplored cards like the Giant, like especially after Zap gets its change, you know, for a long time Zap isn't quite as popular as it is as of recording, so there's a lot of exciting stuff coming up for more Meta Timeline.
And if I had to remember, just as a final sign off, what were the best decks at this time? I remember P.E.K.K.A being very popular. P.E.K.K.A and Golem especially. Like, this was really Golem decks were super strong, especially because now that Elixir Collector worked, you could like play Elixir Collectors, play Golems, and actually play like a second Golem behind your first Golem, either with Mirror or just cycling. And that was a really popular deck. X-Bow was still popular. Mortar, after this, starts to come out a little bit into the archetype. Hog Rider starts to really begin its ascension as a very popular archetype, because I remember people were afraid that without Tombstone, how would you stop Hog Rider? And I think after this update was when people started to switch out Tombstone for cannon, but Hog Rider, Golem, P.E.K.K.A, especially like P.E.K.K.A Witch, Prince, that kind of thing, were sort of the big decks, along with, you know, the X-Bow and Mortar that are still around.
All right, so make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow our Twitter, follow our Twitch at SuperMagicalCup, and stay tuned for more Meta Timeline.